Are we ready for this? Okay. Well, good evening. It's a great pleasure this evening to share with you one further great Victorian artist, probably one of the greatest of the Victorian era, certainly the early Victorian era. An artist extremely interesting in so many ways, but somewhat unfashionable today. And it's my pleasure this evening to introduce you to something of the works of Sir Edwin Landseer. And I tried to break it down into some aspects of his work, and particularly with a focus on his most famous work, and probably the most famous work of the Victorian era, the Monarch of the Glen. Now, Edwin Landseer was born in London in 1802, and he lived 71 years. His later life from 1840 was clouded by severe mental illness and alcoholism, but he still managed to produce some very, very fine works even in the latter part of his career. His work is distinctive for its great skill, his great dexterity with paint and also with the pencil. He was an incredibly skillful draftsman from the age of 7. And I've got one example of his early drawings, which I'm going to show you tonight, which is quite remarkable for a child of that age. Of course, he is the preeminent animal painter of the 19th century. He was widely celebrated throughout the British Empire, but also in the USA and throughout all the world, really. So hence, many of his paintings have travelled to galleries throughout the world. He really is the last important court painter, and of course one great figure who shaped his life is Queen Victoria, and we shall be looking at his relationship with Queen Victoria. Indeed, it was a friendship with Queen Victoria, and producing some of the fine paintings of the Queen's animals, particularly her dogs, and also paintings that suggest her life with Albert as well. So there's a lot to be said about Landseer's closeness to the Queen Victoria and to the court, and really there's not been a painter like him since. His work is also very much part of Victorian. The idea of the sentiment is very important within his work. His certainly, this is why some of his works are now would be considered somewhat kitsch or unfashionable. But he's totally in the spirit of the times, and that is why his works were so widely popular, and mainstream popular with the general public. His work, through his depictions of animals, very much demonstrates nobility. It also, another strong theme within his work is loyalty and heroism. He comes from the Romantic period, really, if we look at him in relationship to artists on the continent like Delacroix or Géricault, we can see some link with that. Landseer was not, he did not do the grand tour like so many other artists of the period. He did travel abroad occasionally, but most of his work was done either in London or in Scotland. And towards the end of his career, we see paintings which deal far more with violence, and there is an undercurrent of pessimism in his later work, which we shall look at with one of his fine, very late paintings that is in Royal Holloway College. This is a drawing by Sir Francis Grant, the President of the Royal Academy, of Landseer at the age of 50. And there he is holding his brushes, and that's a drawing of him. Landseer painted a few self-portraits. Now, The Victorian era, as I've already talked to you about a number of the great artists of this period, is one that is a great period of great change in British art. And the period opens with the wonderful paintings of J.M.W. Turner and his interaction with the Industrial Revolution. And then we think of the pre-Raphaelites who appeared in 1848, 1849, and brought in a whole new forms of realism and a subject matter, linking it to poetry and to Shakespeare in a big way in British art. And so we've looked at those in some of my other talks, and then there are great artists like Daniel Maclise, particularly at the bottom right-hand corner there, Noah's Sacrifice, an artist who was involved in the Westminster murals. And of course, these were taking place very much at the time of during Landseer's earlier part of his career. But his career starts pretty early. Landseer is a painter, primarily known for his animal paintings, and he follows in a tradition within British art, particularly George Stubbs in the 18th century, from the golden age of British painting, but particularly in his own time, the great painter James Ward. And those are two examples of James Ward's paintings. And at a similar period in France, of course, Théodore Géricault was one of the great painters of equestrian subject matter. Now, Joshua Reynolds, in his discourses, had ranked paintings in this way. He'd said that at the very top of the pyramid was history painting, followed by portraiture, and then genre painting, and then landscape painting, and at the very bottom of the pack was animal painting and still life. And it is to Landseer's credit that the Joshua Reynolds sort of list of what painters should really include rather changed, and in fact Landseer elevated animal subject matter within British art to a much higher degree, although he still had to battle against artists who considered that it was only you had to paint history painting or portraiture were the only worthy subjects for a very serious artist. But certainly because of Landseer's royal patronage, he overcame many of those sort of values and the snobbery surrounding it. Now, the Landseer family, Edwin Landseer was one of 14 children, and 4 of those became celebrated and successful artists. And indeed, if you actually Google Landseer artist, you may actually see things that are not by Edwin Landseer, but could be by his father. His father was a notable engraver, and he was an awkward man, was Landseer's father, John Landseer, but he did play a part in his youngest son's education, and certainly his artistic education. 2 of the others I point out are important from the Landseer family is Charles Landseer, who's a celebrated painter, and in fact outlived his brother. And Thomas Landseer, and he plays an important part in Edwin Landseer's life in that he engraved many of Landseer's best known works, and the close relationship between Thomas and Edwin was very important, and so many of Landseer's paintings were known through engravings. Just like many other Victorian artists, his work became distributed through the medium of engraving, and so Thomas Landseer was a very fine engraver, and Landseer would work closely in St John's Wood with Thomas Landseer and on reproductions of his own art. And indeed, because many of Landseer's paintings went straight into the royal collection or private collections, they were only known to the general public through mezzotints and engravings. In the right-hand corner is in Torsch drawing, which shows you an early study by Landseer of a dog. And like George Stubbs, Landseer made many accurate studies of the musculature and skeletal aspects of animals, and so he was thoroughly versed in the anatomy of the animals that he drew, and it was part of the practice, as George Stubbs had done, that artists were to really look at such things as the musculature of animals and see what goes on beneath the fur. Now, Landseer got some early tuition from the celebrated history painter Benjamin Haydon. Now, Benjamin Haydon, as some of you may know, was an artist who was a great he had great connections with many people, but he was also perhaps not the greatest skilled artist, and in fact his life ended tragically in his suicide around the age of 60. And in fact, even Landseer was somewhat not implicated in it, but he was mentioned in the note that Haydon left, that he had been let down by L, who had not supplied him with funds, because Haydon was constantly running out of money and felt he was cruelly and unjustly overlooked by many of his contemporaries. But in the early years of Landseer's life, Haydon had encouraged the young Edwin Landseer in aspects of drawing and painting and the mechanics as Landseer entered into the Royal Academy. And so it was, but he kept a relationship with Haydon, and certainly, so Haydon, his suicide took place in 1846 when Landseer was a very well established and probably the most famous artist, apart from Turner, by 1844. And we can see that Landseer would have taken no tips about drawing horses from Haydon. If you look at this painting, which is in Exeter Art Gallery, which I used to do some voluntary work at, this painting dominates one of the galleries, and there we are. You can see he doesn't quite paint horses in quite the way that Landseer could. So the antecedents to Landseer's art, we've already looked at that a little bit, but certainly in the previous century, the golden age of British art, Thomas Gainsborough was a wonderful painter of dogs, George Stubbs, an exceptional painter of horses and animals of all types. And then we look too to Dutch painting, particularly David Teniers the Younger, who often depicted animals, and particularly monkeys, in such as the painting up here, smoking and drinking monkeys. I would also suggest that Sir David Wilkie, the great Scots artist, his great painting here, The Blind Fiddler, which was a very important painting in the early part of the 19th century as a genre painting, was also a great influence upon the young Edwin Landseer. And we can see that in some of his Highland subject matter and his genre paintings. And that's a very fine painting there by Sir David Wilkie, who was a great friend of J.M.W. Turner. So this is an early painting by Edwin Landseer, one that was exhibited at the Royal Academy when he was 17 or 18 years old, alpine mastiffs reanimating a distressed traveller. But it shows very much already Landseer's consummate skill in draftsmanship and his ability to depict animals in such a way as to give them real life. And he certainly goes well beyond someone like James Ward's paintings, and we really sense almost those dogs upon the snow and the St Bernard dogs coming to revivify the traveller in the path of St Gothard, of course made famous by many of Turner's wonderful engravings and paintings. So this is Landseer's painting, so a great example of an early work by Landseer, age 18, and you can see already he is an artist of enormous skill and breadth. And this is a drawing of him at a similar period by another celebrated Victorian artist, George Hayter. pen drawing of Landseer. Now, Landseer was quite a man of short stature, 5'3", but he was immensely charming. He certainly was a ladies' man, as we would say. He was a great raconteur. He was certainly in his early life, he was very much a party goer, and he had an enormous social circle, partly due to the fact of introductions through Haydn, but also his own father too knew many of the artists of the period, and of course they were involved with the engravings as well. And so John Landseer, he had brought Edwin Landseer into that world pretty early on. And it was this early success that led the young Edwin Landseer to Abbotsford, Sir Walter Scott's home. And of course, Sir Walter Scott welcomed the young artist, this emerging artist, to his great home, Abbotsford. There's a photograph of it there. And of course, Scott, very well known and much loved, and plays a part within Landseer's own work, and obviously within all the early Victorian artists. Very, very often they are illustrative of Scott's work, and it's also very much a period where there is this English love affair with Scotland, and the aristocracy spending a great deal of time, particularly after in the late summers and the autumns in Scotland. And indeed, Landseer also, this is part of his life. He spends much of the autumn and early winter in Scotland every year, similar to my other great love, John Everett Millais, and so there are many of these would go up to Scotland. But certainly Landseer forms a good relationship with Sir Walter Scott. He doesn't initially paint Scott's portrait, which you can see above, which is a marvellous portrait. It's in the National Gallery of Scotland. There it is, of Scott. He was quite a lot older than Landseer, of course, but he wins Scott around by painting all of Sir Walter Scott's dogs. And there we can see a couple of examples. There's this scene at Abbotsford, and you can see there with the armour and the dogs there. And also he also paints just the corner of Sir Francis Chantry's studio, and Chantry, of course, had also made that famous bust of Scott, and you can see a version of that in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. So we think all of the time of in the background there is the figure of Scott's Waverley novels, of the subject matter of Scotland. Really impresses it in itself upon a Londoner, Edwin Landseer, and of course he's much celebrated for his Scottish subjects, but there is a sort of irony that he is a Londoner, and yet he paints possibly one of the greatest paintings of Scotland, the Monarch of the Glen, which of course has, in recent times, people have said, well, was it actually painted in Scotland? Possibly it was painted back in London, or most of it. Here we are. Now, so these are examples of some of his earlier subject matters. He was quite an innovative artist, was Edwin Landseer. He could do pot boilers, but he did this one here, The Stonebreaker and His Daughter from 1830, shows him very much in the vanguard of painting the rural poor, which of course was a great subject matter for the great realist in France, Gustave Courbet, from 20 years later. And the pre-Raphaelite Henry Wallace in 1857 also painted The Death of a Stonebreaker. But here is Landseer's take upon this subject, which was become very, very popular within European art. The stonebreakers were the lowest rung in society, and so of course painting it here, it shows him laying down his tools for just a moment's rest in his hard toil. So that's a painting by Landseer from 1830. Ruskin admired some of Landseer's works, and Landseer is cited in early volumes of Modern Painters, and many of his works demonstrate what is a principle that Ruskin points to as vital beauty. If it was Queen Victoria who was one of the great shapers of Landseer's life, the other one most undoubtedly was Georgiana Russell, the Duchess of Bedford, the second wife of the Duke of Bedford. And it was this prolonged affair with the Duchess of Bedford that really colours Landseer's life and shapes his life in so many ways. He met the Duchess of Bedford just following the meeting with Sir Walter Scott, and she is the subject of quite a number of his gentle illustrations. You can see that it was a prolonged affair. Now, the Duchess of Bedford was 20 years senior to Landseer, so she was in her 40s and he was in his 20s. But it seems to have been a relationship that was somewhat known in society and was alluded to, but in more recent years, more has been uncovered about this. That's a painting of the Duchess of Bedford. I think that one is by Thomas Lawrence, not by Landseer. But on the top left-hand corner, we can see this Landseer scene in the Highlands, which depicts both the Duchess of Bedford and Duke Gordon in 1825. It seems that the Duke of Bedford although not necessarily approving of the affair, was aware of it, and he did not dismiss Landseer. Landseer paints many paintings of their family, and indeed many wonderful portraits of the Duchess herself, and we can look at some of those. But he also paints. He's totally captivated as a result of his meeting with Sir Walter Scott. He paints a lot of these Highland subject matter pictures in the 1820s. A good example would be this illicit Highland whiskey still from 1829. So Landseer stood in his 20s painting this. They are not sort of social realist in the way an artist like Courbet or perhaps some of the later pre-Raphaelites would be. They're somewhat sentimental, we would consider them today, and they don't perhaps deal with the harsher aspects of poverty, and they somewhat romanticize the scenes in these bothies. But you can see that there's this one called The Flood in the Highlands. It's another good example of a Landseer work from this period. Wonderful animals. I would like you, please note, there's always a dog or in sympathy, or horse in the background in these. And Landseer gives full rein to his extraordinary skill in depicting animals. But they don't make social critique in quite the way as, shall we say, Thomas Fayard's painting from 40 years later, the Last of the Clan, which then alludes to the poverty in the Highlands and Highland clearances and the difficulties that people would experience there. The Shepherd's Home here from 1824 is a very good example of a Landseer work, which is nice, gentle genre subject in a Highland home, and pleasing enough, but nothing very radical about that particular painting. So it is widely thought that that the Duchess of Bedford's daughter Rachel was indeed Landseer's daughter, and Landseer doted over Rachel, and he paints this very touching portraits of her. One here is Red Riding Hood, and this other one of her dressed in green, He paints them with great tenderness. We don't often think of Landseer perhaps as a great portraitist, but when he pushed to it, he could be a really superb painter of character, and certainly these are good examples. Also, he was one of the first artists to pick on the Red Riding Hood subject in British art as well, and we think of many later famous British painters who depicted Red Riding Hood, Millet and Watts particularly, but he does it in 1837, so a good 20 years before either of those pick up their brush and do that. That's a portrait of the 6th Duke of Bedford there, who became very gravely ill and died in 1839. Now, Landseer fully thought that he might, that following the Duke's death, that he might have a life with the Duchess. However, she was to turn him down, we understand, and this caused a severe crisis for Landseer, and it was probable that that was the cause of Landseer's breakdown in 1840. Now, Landseer always has a complicated relationship with hunting and fishing. Whilst he loved animals and he despised needless cruelty, he was also, like so many Victorians, a hunter, and he liked field sports. And so a number of his paintings depict field sports in one form or another. But he certainly disliked needless cruelty, and as his life went on, he becomes more and more of a critic of just these great drives of shooting many hundreds of grouse on the moors and things like that. So if we look at this painting here, this is one of his famous hunting paintings, The Hunting of Chevy Chase, 1825-26. These were very popular. I think this is a similar period to someone like in France, like Delacroix painting The Lion Hunt, but this is a very British version, a Scots version of it, and this is The Hunting of Chevy Chase there. Hawking in olden time, 1832, when he was 30 years old. And again, he shows an enormous understanding of the flight of birds, and someone who really is a great observer of nature. But he's all the time, he has an uneasy relationship about blood sports, believe it or not. And he certainly, as his life goes on, he becomes more and more critical of needless and wanton killing. The other great project of the 1820s was this Munchiana, or Men in Miniature, and he produces this folio of paintings following the tradition of David Teniers the Younger, the Dutch painter, of looking at monkeys or apes and depicting them, this anthropomorphic attitude, which we get in Landseer in many aspects of his paintings, and you get them with some of his dogs. There's another good example there of a Jack in Office. That's quite a well-known painting of his. How he's able to imbue monkeys and apes with character, and very often caricature too. So Landseer was a great artist. He was able to pick on certain traits within animals, but also ally them with human behaviour as well. And of course, this accords with much that was going on in Victorian England at the time. There was a questioning about the relationship between the primates and humans, and of course that finds its very much its place in the work of Charles Darwin in 1860, and the publication of The Origin of Species coming widely available then. So there was this changing attitude, and Landseer's paintings reflect this changing attitude towards other animals. And this one from his earlier period, The Cat's Paw, which shows a monkey torturing a cat by putting a cat's paw against the fire grate, plays into the earlier idea about monkeys being mischievous and even evil and malevolent. And then later on, there's this kind of questioning in Landseer's work. We don't know his views on Darwin or evolutionary theory. We don't. There's no letters that can be cited on that. But certainly his looking at man and beast was something that was very interesting in his later work, and certainly we'll see that in his later Arctic painting, for which he was so famed, and certainly about man's place in the universe, much as Tennyson had looked at in Memoriam as well, comes into Landseer's later work. We also see it in Byam Shaw's work in 1901, with this quotation from the biblical Ecclesiastes, who knoweth the spirit of the man that goeth upward, and the spirit of the beast that goeth downward to the earth. It's this questioning, and Landseer brings this about within his work, and he's certainly very alive to aspects of animal behavior and being parallel with human behavior. And so that's a good example. The cat's paw is an excellent example of that earlier attitude. A painting today that we would find absolutely cruel, and perhaps we wouldn't really want to think too much about it. Here we are. But as recreation, when he was with the Duchess of Bedford, he would spend plenty of time in Scotland when he was working for Victoria, whom he came to started to work for them in 1838 at Balmoral. He was out painting the countryside, and he's a very effective landscape painter. But none of these landscapes I'm showing you here were actually exhibited in the Royal Academy. They're private. They are celebrations of nature and his love of painting out of doors and depicting nature as it is. And some of his Highland paintings are extremely good paintings, and very, very fulsome and beautiful, full of life and interesting. That one at Bolton Abbey is, of course, a famous spot in Yorkshire, which is depicted by so many Victorian artists, and that's just slightly pre-Victorian, but it gives you a good example of Landseer's skill as a landscape painter. And perhaps this one, Wayside Plants from 1860s, shows the influence of the Pre-Raphaelites upon his work. You wouldn't think of Landseer as a Pre-Raphaelite, but certainly it's a nod in the direction to the Pre-Raphaelites, painting plants with such accuracy as he has done in that particular study. And this painting Ruskin cites as an example of vital beauty, the old shepherd's chief mourner. Probably one of the earlier, most famous paintings of Landseer, and this exhibits this whole idea of loyalty that is so often a part of Landseer's work. And this is so beloved by Queen Victoria too. She loved the way that Landseer could really capture the dogs in this particular way, that they weren't just dogs, but they had character, and they had feelings too, and they could show those sort of things. You know, and you get it again in Millet's painting, The Order of Release, here. But in a way, Millet is a nod into the direction of Landseer in that particular painting, The Order of Release. But Landseer got there first, and he does these wonderful studies of dogs, and for which he is really, really notable. He also contributes to Heath's Book of Beauty. This is a number of plates, and it was really just a book, just as it says, really. And this is the Duchess of Abercorn and her child, 1834. Many of these were then engraved and became part of the Book of Beauty, certainly before photogravures and photography publications later in the Victorian era. This was something, a good way of getting to know Landseer's work. And but Landseer's paintings are always, you know, they always have this sort of freedom of touch as well, and this lightness of touch, which really sets him apart from so many other artists of this period, that he doesn't have a cloying, over detailed sort of surface. He's got this lovely touch, which is so attractive. During this period, in 1839, Landseer paints this celebrated painting here of Isaac van Ambra and his animals, and he used to have a cage in which he would lie with the animals. He would wear a Roman costume, and there was a sort of show that went on, and the Queen Victoria delighted in this particular show, and she loved seeing these animals and these antics. One of many, actually. There was the Exeter Exchange in the Strand, also had various menageries that various of them would come and collect. Among the aristocracy, there was quite a penchant for collecting exotic animals and having a lion or or some exotic animal in a cage. And of course, with the empire, a number of tigers were brought back, and so this particular one was a particular favorite of Queen Victoria. And if you notice behind the showman in the painting, keep in mind this is 1839, and that lion there. Well, we'll visit him again, actually, because we'll see him at the base of Nelson's column later on. So that's the earliest version, which becomes one of the four great lions at the base of Nelson's column. And but as I say, the first serious mental breakdown was in 1840, following the rejection by the Duchess of Bedford. And we notice a change in Landseer's painting from this period. He still fulfilled his commissions, although he could procrastinate terribly, and some of his commissions took 3 or 4 years, and he would constantly put people off. But some of his more private paintings, such as this one on the left, indicates something of his mental state at the time, a sort of fog that was descending upon him. He also began to fondness for alcohol, and he did become alcoholic. And this is sort of known. And yet he was such a celebrated artist. He sort of always could sort of pull it together and pull off great paintings, even though there were periods of great melancholy and difficulty, really, for the last 30 years of his life. Richard Ormond often talks about this, and he's a great commentator upon Landseer, and of course John Singer Sargent as well. So we will notice a change in some of Landseer's work as the century develops. But this 1841, the year after the breakdown, he paints this wonderful painting for the Prince Consort. Jos, the favourite greyhound of Prince Consort. Well, look at that wonderful sheen on the coat of the greyhound there. I mean, a remarkable piece of painting, and you can see why Victoria and Albert just loved Landseer. They, you know, who could paint a dog in quite that way and bring their dogs to life in such a way? And it was during this period that they started. At Balmoral, they started a collection of dog paintings, and also they have a pet cemetery at Balmoral, which I'll show you a picture of that a bit later. And so Landseer was often engaged by both Victoria and Albert to paint all their pets and make good studies. And Landseer was a rapid worker too, so he was able to execute these things with remarkable skill, but also great accuracy. And you can see why Albert would have loved that one. Also, this lovely little one here of the lovebirds as well. Beautiful painting. So delighted Victoria and Albert. And he also painted them at Windsor Castle, the happy couple. Together. Now, to keep this painting in mind, I'm going to show you one which is painted sometime later after Albert's untimely death. So this is full of light, and you're looking on the lower terrace at Windsor Castle. Albert and Victoria surrounded by their pets, as we can see, and also obviously a successful shooting party in the morning, where you can see the game, the ducks on the floor of the castle, but also the tender look between Victoria and Albert there. And although he wasn't a court painter in the way that Winterhalter had been, he was fully employed by them to paint their animals. And so when he was at Balmoral, he would have rooms in the stable block, but he was often in conversation with Victoria, and in fact he was one of the few people during Victoria's prolonged period of mourning that Victoria would spend time with Landseer. And indeed, both Victoria and Albert did visit Landseer's studio at St John's Wood in London, and actually pay him a visit. So he was on very, very good terms with the royal family. So here we are. Here's the contrast. 1865 to 67. We see here Queen Victoria in mourning, and here is her faithful John Brown standing by this black steed here, and this is also a little sculpture of John Brown by Landseer. And we can see again the contrast between the light of the Windsor portrait of Victoria and Albert, and then this much more somber Victoria in her morning dress with Osborne House behind, ladies in waiting upon the chair in the garden, and then the various. She's reading through her. She's got her state box, the red box on the floor, and also a number of letters that you can see, all beautifully painted by Landseer with the wax seal upon them, and Victoria's gloves have fallen onto the ground there. But again, the faithful dog looking up to Her Majesty, but the other dog turned away, almost implying that there's a sadness about this painting too. It's good to see those two paintings together. So it's sunshine and shadow, really, and this is the shadow, the great shadow that fell upon Victoria following the death of her beloved Albert. And now Landseer, because of his mental troubles, although he was invited to become president of the Royal Academy, he in fact declined, and he wouldn't probably have made a good president as an administrator because of his periods of melancholy. So a painting by Francis Grant, the president of the Royal Academy, a portrait of Landseer, and that is of the hanging committee at the RA just shortly after Landseer's death. But basically, the Royal Academy, which moved to Burlington House. In most of Landseer's life as a painter, he would have shown at what is now the National Gallery, which was the Royal Academy on Trafalgar Square, but they moved to Burlington House in 1870, and so the last few paintings by Landseer as his yearly exhibitions were shown at the Burlington House. And those of you who know Burlington House know it's got another story now, but when it moved to Burlington House initially, this is how it looked. And so Landseer, although we talk about his later career not as being checkered in some ways, he always was able to show work every summer at the summer exhibition, and was still enormously respected and highly thought of. He was also an excellent caricaturist, and here's some I've selected just to show you a little bit of it. There's one there in the bottom right-hand corner of the Duke of Devonshire, something almost of Edward Lear about this caricature of Edward Elise as a robin, and then what about this lovely drawing of Paganini? Again, beautifully drawn and so rapidly drawn. You can understand he would have been at one of these parties at either at Windsor or at Balmoral, where he was being able to draw such people, and he captures them beautifully in a way. And he's a great caricaturist. And there are a number of these drawings in the British Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum, I believe. And I promised to show you one of his early drawings. There we are. There's a drawing of one of his one of the cows at the age, or a bull at the age when he was age 7. That's on the right. So that's an incredible drawing for a child of 7. And then of course he continues. This is 60 years. You know, he's almost 60 years old when he paints this one here. But this is a great painting, you know, Chillingham Northumbrian cattle. He was excellent at that, and that's a good example of some of the sort of work that he would show at the Royal Academy when it wasn't a sort of one of his other bigger subjects. And the hunt is also a great theme within Landseer's work, and also violence. And these are some paintings that sort of prefigure Monarch of the Glen, really. The hunted stag from 1832 to 33. Yes, that a very, very powerful image. Similar in a way to some of the work that was going on in France that you could see, and particularly artists like Courbet later on painted the hunt as well. But that's a remarkable piece of painting, particularly as it's sort of enveloping in a Highland spate as well. And then this other one, coming events cast their shadow before them, the challenge, where you see this buck and then the icy mountains around it. It's very, very dramatic scene. But one can see in Landseer he has this grandiose, almost theatrical quality to some of his great paintings. And this one, Sanctuary, of 1842, is again beautifully composed, and it has this lovely light to it as well. And certainly Victoria and Albert very much like these paintings, and many of these paintings of stags found their way into the royal collection. And of course, it accorded with so many of the aristocracy at the time who loved hunting and the hunt and the chase. And so these paintings were instantly successful. So we come to probably the most famous painting of certainly of the latter part of the 19th century in British art, and this is the Monarch of the Glen, which has happily now passed into the National Gallery of Scotland's collection. And I was fortunate enough to go and see it 4 years ago, and it went out from a Dewar's Distillery collection, and it's now on proud display in Edinburgh. And it really follows the tradition of Stubbs in a way, that his wonderful painting Whistle Jacket from the century before. But Landseer composes this iconic image of, we think we know it so well from all its sort of reproductions, but it is a very, very powerfully painted piece of painting. It shows the stag not hunted, but absolutely at the centre of this of beautiful Highland Glen. We can't actually say where it is. There are many, many places in Scotland where people have sort of thought they could identify the actual glen, but that can't really be done. Landseer began the sketch for it apparently with a poker and a piece of charcoal, but he gets the pose just right. It's life size, of course. It's a very, very impressive painting, but like almost like the Mona Lisa, it's become so well known that we can hardly see it for what it is, and it's almost become a kitsch image as well too, because of its appropriation for commercial purposes. So, but it was originally destined to be hung in the refreshment rooms of the House of Lords in 1851. Now, Landseer had played no part in the Westminster murals or the redecoration of the Palace of Westminster following Sir Giles Barry's new buildings following the great fire at Westminster, the former Houses of Parliament being burnt down. Many great and younger artists were involved with the murals, and indeed people like Haydn had tried to do murals, and partly him being rejected from doing a mural caused part of Haydn's breakdown, really. But Landseer was invited to supply paintings for the refreshment room, and these were to be paintings of the chase and possibly rural subjects, and the Monarch of the Glen. Now, Landseer was somewhat ambivalent about the idea. He had just been ennobled as well. He'd become Sir Edwin Landseer. He rather felt it might not fulfil the full requirements there, and indeed the painting never really was hung there, and then it went into private hands quite swiftly. So it didn't actually stay long there, and but it wasn't like one of the other subjects that beautified the House of Lords. It wasn't on a serious historical subject. It was, but in some ways it does exhibit royalty, and it was very much allied with the idea of majesty as well as this painting. So its symbolism is not lost on the Victorians. And of course, through prints, it was immediately appropriated. Following Landseer's death, of course, now you can't walk down the mile in Edinburgh without seeing it on almost every type of tea towel and box of shortbread or whiskey bottles. It's everywhere. It's so, but that was none of Landseer's doing, really. It's just because it is such a powerful image that it has been appropriated in that way. And of course, Landseer, unlike Millet, never gave his permission for his work to be reproduced in this way. It was a man called Barrett who, in fact, actually first had the Monarch of the Glen reproduced in a commercial way through an engraving. Millet in 1886 had given permission for his painting Bubbles to be reproduced as a soap pears advert, and of course the great controversy around that. And then ever since then, of course, there is an uneasy relationship between the commercial appropriation of fine art and the artist and the idea of high art. And it lingers on into this century. Look at that cartoon from Punch of Lloyd George, and I'm talking about land grabbing, and it's the Monarch of the Glen, a new Landseer, and that is Lloyd George with his land campaign holding aloft and riding the Monarch of the Glen. And then Ronald Searle in an illustration in Punch does a sort of play upon Picasso, how Picasso might have depicted the Monarch of the Glen. And then our own living artist, Sir Peter Blake, just before he painted the cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the collage there, his work that brought him to notice was actually a copy of the Monarch of the Glen after Sir Edwin Landseer. I would point out in 1960s, it was deeply kitsch and deeply unfashionable to cite artists like Landseer, and yet they never left the public imagination. And even in 2017 in The Sun, they're still commenting upon Landseer. There's a little thing here I saw. It says, "Dearie me, Scotland's iconic deer in Sir Edwin Landseer's Monarch of the Glen painting is actually English, according to sensational claims." So it's a painting still surrounded by all kinds of views and controversy, and this will always be the way, but it's what Landseer is really known for. And again, it comes out in another way. In Julian Calder's photograph of the Queen for her 60th anniversary in 2012, took this photograph at Balmoral, totally conscious of Monarch of the Glen and painting, and it's known as the true Monarch of the Glen, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II painted. And of course, that links it also with Landseer's paintings of Queen Victoria there by Loch Laggan. And I promised to show you part of the pet cemetery at Balmoral, and this is Sir Edgar Bowen's Queen Victoria's dog Noble from 1867, and he too spent time at Balmoral as well. And of course, in the recent passing of Her Majesty, we've seen glimpses of Balmoral and this beloved place of the royal family, and such a beautiful place too. And of course, Landseer made the most of it when he was up there, and many of his paintings are in Balmoral Castle. And it was in 1867 that Landseer was unusually commissioned to do 4 of the most important sculptures in Britain, and they are the lions at the feet of Nelson's Column, opposite the National Gallery. So you couldn't be in a more prominent place. It's unusual because, of course, Landseer, although he did make clay models of animals occasionally, on this scale he had no experience of this at all. And we have this lovely painting of him by Ballantyne at work on these 4 lions on the pediment of the Trafalgar Square on Nelson's Column. Now, he actually did work them in clay, and then they were cast by the famous sculptor Carlo Marchetti, an Italian who lived in London, very famous at the time. And so he cast them, and they are really a great testament to Landseer's brilliance. Even in the later years of his life, he was still able to work on and conceive something quite new, but very, very ambitious too. And this is possibly his greatest last painting, really, 1864, Man Proposes, God Disposes, very much echoing themes from In Memoriam, the idea of man's place in the universe, and it certainly is nature read in tooth and claw. There is some antecedents to this painting. Whether Landseer would have known of Edwin Church's painting, The Iceberg from 1861, painted 3 years before Landseer's work, is quite probable. It depicts the Lord Franklin's demise and the destruction of his boat in failing to find the Northwest Passage. And so we've got two polar bears there pulling apart the sails, ripping the sails apart, but as if tearing into human flesh. And if you notice under the polar bear on the right, we can actually see a rib cage, possibly indicating that of Franklin himself. Of course, this great story of Franklin and of his expedition of 1845 captured the Victorian imagination. And of course, the whole seeking of the Northwest Passage was of great importance and interest to the empire, really. If we could find that passage, the opening up of the Canadian prairies would follow and bring even greater wealth to the country. And we think of Millet's great painting, the Northwest Passage, painted in 1874, I think 10 years after Landseer's painting, but that makes reference to this painting too. But Landseer's painting is bleak. It has a pessimism which is entering his work now. The painting is a remarkable piece of work, and it hangs in the Royal Holloway College Picture Gallery, and I really recommend it. But he did do pot boilers too, and towards the end of his life he painted some quite strange paintings. This one of Lady Godiva's Prayer from 1867. You know, I mean, it wouldn't be for what he would become best known. It certainly shows a decline from a wonderful painting like Monarch of the Glen. He also painted some interesting, very late religious subjects too, and this one, the baptismal font from 1870, is possibly his last painting, and depicts a font with the descending of the dove and of course the sheep, the flock, the church around the base of the font. The font is borne actually by a donkey, or I believe. I think behind there. Anyway, it's an interesting little painting, but certainly nothing like as great as his earlier work, which is so celebrated. Now, his mental illness became so severe that by July of 1872 he was declared insane, and his brother they had him put in just under psychiatric care. He was attended to by Sir Richard Quain, who was the great physician to so many of the great Victorian artists, and he looked after Landseer in those troubling last years of Landseer's life. It was a very, very difficult time. He had hallucinations. These were all aggravated by his drug and alcohol abuse, and he sunk into this terrible trough. But however, on his deathbed, he requested that Millet would finish his unfinished paintings, and so 4 of Landseer's unfinished works, which were on the easel, Millet finished. He took some time to finish them, I would have you know, and he didn't. The Finding of the Otter, I can't really say Millet finished with any great fin. He didn't complete it in quite his normal style, but he did this one of Nell Gwyn, which he did work on quite a bit, and Millet placed his own daughter upon the horse that Landseer had painted. And Millet was a good friend to Landseer, sharing many of the same pursuits, like the field sports and Scotland, of course, were both important to both these artists. And also Landseer was befriended also by William Powell Frith as well. So these 2 academicians were well disposed towards Landseer, even though he had become very difficult, and his mental illness made a lot of communication with him really, really very, very hard. Anyway, Landseer's passing left a gap in British art, and one that has really never been filled since, in a way. We think of paintings of animals since Landseer's time as perhaps being far less dramatic. I mean, if you look at Breton Riviere's Strayed from the Flock, or paintings by Farquharson, or even Rosa Bonheur's Horse Fair, they're not necessarily as strong as some of Landseer's work when he was in his prime. And we think of contemporary artists like Sir Henry Moore or Dame Elizabeth Frink, who make animals their subject matter, and perhaps they are the true heirs of Landseer's legacy. Edwin Landseer Lutyens, the great architect, particularly of New Delhi, bears his name because his father was a personal friend of Landseer. But Landseer is one of the greats of 19th century art, and I hope I've given you a little bit of an insight into his life and his work this evening. And these are the galleries which I'm thankful for, and where I've taken some of the photographs for this evening. And if you're interested in when any of these pictures are, I can let you know. But these are the main ones that have very good collections of Landseer's work. Of course, much of his work is in private hands too. And so I shall stop my share.